Good evening and welcome to tonight's lecture. I am Minjung Kim, the Barbara B. Taylor Director of the St. Louis Art Museum, and it is my great pleasure to be with you this evening, both in person and virtually. Tonight's program marks the opening of the exhibition Age of Armor, Treasures from the Higgins Armory Collection at the Worcester Art Museum. The Higgins Armory Collection is the nation's second largest collection of arms and armor, including more than 1,500 objects ranging from ancient Egypt to 19th century Japan, but with particular strengths in suits of steel armor from medieval and Renaissance Europe. This exhibition presents highlights from this collection in a major survey of defensive armor in Europe from its origins in the 1300s to today. And in addition to works from the Higgins collection, the exhibition shows depictions of armor in artworks from the St. Louis Art Museum collection, including works by Lucas Cranach the Elder, Albrecht Dürer, and rarely exhibited Flemish tapestries. The exhibition is organized by the Worcester Art Museum and originally curated by tonight's speaker, Jeffrey L. Forgang. And I would also like to acknowledge and thank my curatorial colleagues who have made SLAM's presentation unique. David Conradson, the Grace L. Brumbaugh, and Richard E. Brumbaugh, Curator of Decorative Arts and Design, and Curatorial Research Assistant, Catherine Feldkamp. I would also like to note that the exhibition is presented with generous support from the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation, and major support is provided by the E. Desmond Lee Family Endowment for Exhibitions. Tonight's speaker, Jeffrey L. Forgang, is the Higgins Curator of Arms and Armor and Medieval Art at the Worcester Art Museum and the organizing curator of the exhibition that you will see tonight. Dr. Forgang earned a BA with honors in history from Brown University and an MA and PhD in Old and Middle English and Scandinavian languages and literature, and their points of contact from the Center for Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto. From 1999 to 2013, he served as the Paul S. Morgan Curator of the Higgins Collection in Worcester, Massachusetts. And since 2014, when the collection was donated to the Worcester Art Museum, he has continued to serve as the collection's curator. He lectures and publishes extensively on topics ranging from Robin Hood, swords and swordsmanship to chivalry, and has organized and contributed to numerous exhibitions drawing on the strengths of the Higgins collection. It is my honor to welcome to the stage Jeffrey Forgang to open the St. Louis Art Museum's presentation of this extraordinary exhibition of European armor. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Forgang to the podium.
Thanks for that lovely introduction, Minjung. And I just have to say, I've had a wonderful time here at your museum. You are really so lucky to have such an extraordinary institution, such an extraordinary collection in your midst. I have been astonished by the objects that I have seen today, clearly collected over a long period of time with discipline and foresight by people with very talented eyes. I have to admit a little bit of jealousy of some of the things that I have seen today. But today I'm above all delighted to share with you my own collection, and I'll begin with a question. What does armor mean to you? you're here this evening, you've come to hear me speak, you are very likely going to go see the exhibition soon if you haven't already. Obviously, there's something about it that really draws you. And obviously, you're not alone. There's a lot of you here. I gather there's another 200 people out there online. Arms and Armor has this sort of perennial draw, and I really encourage people to sort of think about what is the visceral reaction that you have to these objects that really inspires that kind of attention? Do you know, when you look at these objects, are you filled with awe, with wonder, with astonishment at the craftsmanship? Does it make you think of a sort of distant, semi-legendary past, a world in which amazing adventures could happen in a way that really isn't possible in the modern world? Maybe you also look at these objects and think, as many people do, wonder how was it made and what was it like to wear? One of the most interesting things about these objects is that people back in the day had a lot of the same reactions. They knew the practicalities around armor, how it was made and how it was worn, but a lot of the sort of mythic dimension of armor, the kinds of things that make people come to these exhibitions today, that get people excited about watching Game of Thrones or taking part in an online computer game, these sort of pop culture aspects of Arms and Armor, they're very much alive in the period when these objects were actually in living use. And I think that's one of the things that's most remarkable about them. And we'll see some aspects of that over the course of the next while. This the shirt toward the beginning of the exhibition is a really great way to start to understand armor of the Middle Ages. When we think of the Middle Ages, and when we think of when we think of the Middle Ages and knights, we think of knights in shining armor. But for the most part, a knight's personal body armor during most of the Middle Ages basically was some version of what you see here. Mail, chainmail, as it's often called, protecting the body, made up of many, tens of thousands of interlocked rings of iron or steel, each one riveted shut, and that pretty much was the basis of a knight's equipment through most of the Middle Ages. He might have a solid helmet on his head, but the body armor, by and large, consisted of mail, not the kind of suit of articulated plate steel that we tend to think of in association with knights. So this image here gives you something of an idea of what knights were wearing for most of the Middle Ages in some version or another. This represented really the high point, the finest, the most effective battle armor, battle protection that was available for most of the Middle Ages, in combination with the knight's lance, his sword, with his highly trained war horse, and a high-backed saddle. And you can see how he's the figure on the left there on the green-clad horse is sort of wedged into position on between the high-backed saddle and his feet thrust forward into his stirrups. He's wearing state-of-the-art military equipment of the day, and he's basically a tank of the medieval battlefield, capable of delivering a tremendous amount of power from that really solid seat on horseback, aiming all the power of that charging man and horse, all of that kinetic energy through the lance at whoever happens to be have the misfortune to be at the far end of it. And this image is great in giving you a sense of the sheer kinetic energy of that knightly charge. By the time this illustration was made, knights were starting to incorporate elements of solid plate steel into their equipment here and there, often protecting vulnerable places like the knee. Over the course of the 1300s, this process really takes off. By 1400, the well-dressed knight is equipped in head to toe in a suit of articulated plate armor. And this knee guard that you can see in the exhibition is a very rare and precious example, surviving example of early example of medieval plate armor. There just isn't all that much of it surviving. Most of the armor that you might see in a museum typically today dates to after 1500. Indeed, most of it after 1550, if not even after 1600. So this is a precious early survival. The chainmail shirt, the mail shirt, is essentially kind of a metal t-shirt. There's really not an awful lot of decorative features. As you saw in the earlier example, knights would typically wear some kind of a fancy cloth surcoat over top of that had the decorative impact that the mail itself wasn't able to offer. But these suits of plate steel really afforded sculptural possibilities. And knights got rid of the surcoat, and during the 1400s, armorers developed these very sophisticated forms of sculptural wearable steel to make plate armor a form of high fashion for the battlefield. And indeed, the kind of armor that was being made and worn was in dialogue, constant dialogue with male civilian fashion of the day. So for example, the Italian style tended to emphasize rounded shapes. This spectacular breastplate from the exhibition can be compared to the kind of rounded garments that you see worn by the figures in this contemporary image. Even that little sort of rippled effect that you see at the shoulders on this, the armholes on this relatively ordinary breastplate, imitate the bunching of the fabric that would happen on a man's jacket at that particular spot. The Italians, as I said, tended to go for simpler, plainer styles that emphasized the overall form of the metal. The Germans, meantime, evolved a style that involved a lot of rippled decoration on the surface. It's often referred to as Gothic in comparison to Gothic cathedrals, the sort of ribbed surfaces that one sees, the cusped points, the angularity and long lines that you can see in the Gothic pauldron that's on display in the exhibition, or this figure of St. George, have a lot in common with the architecture of medieval cathedrals. So armor by the late 1400s has become very much a fashion statement, but it is also a very effective kind of technology on the battlefield. It's carefully constructed, shaped, and assembled to work with the wearer. The armoring process begins with a padded jacket. You can well imagine that if you were to wear armor without any kind of padding underneath, it could start to get extremely uncomfortable, not to mention the fact that you do sweat quite profusely in a suit of armor. So the padded jacket gives you some sort of cushioning as well as a disposable garment, ultimately something that can be changed or exchanged at much less cost than the armor itself. And the armor is assembled on top of that jacket, tied in place with laces at many parts, kind of akin to shoelaces on the shoulder piece that you just saw, and indeed when the close-ups that you see at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Those double holes, wherever you see double holes on armor, that is one of the places where laces were tied to assemble the suit of armor. And one of the things that's really fabulous about this is there is actually a survival to this day. The arm armor would be laced at the shoulders, and to this day, dress uniforms often still include braided lacing that ultimately has its origins in the laces that were used to tie the armor in place. So with the full assembled armor in place, the knight was extraordinarily well protected and also extremely mobile. We tend to think about the knights as being these sort of lumbering dinosaurs of the battlefield, overweighted, over-encumbered, kind of incapable of moving. These guys were, in fact, highly trained martial artists. They won fights through their lifetime of training and skill. And they pretty much had complete free range of motion. The only thing you can't really do in a suit of armor is to raise your arms directly over your head because the shoulder pieces get in the way. Everything else has been designed to move entirely with freedom along with the body. It's really an extraordinary feat of late medieval engineering. And the armor doesn't weigh nearly as much as we tend to imagine it does, typically between 40 and 60 pounds or so. Modern soldiers may wear upwards of 100 or carry upwards of 100 pounds in the field. But 40 to 60 extra pounds plus weapons and so on, that's not insignificant. These guys had to be in really good physical shape to deal with the extra weight that they were carrying around, not to mention the overheating, the loss of water through sweat, and so on, that armored combat entailed. They had to be in really good training. They took part in addition to their training specifically in martial arts of the day. They engaged in things like running races, jumping contests, throwing javelin, shot put, and indeed the modern sport of vaulting, the sort of the gymnast sort of things that one does. If you've ever seen, there's a particular version of the equipment that the vaulter uses that's got sort of a big kind of barrel-shaped object with a couple of handles on it. And as you may be aware, it's called a vaulting horse. And the reason is because this actually used to be a horse. The knights trained in these kinds of gymnastic, acrobatic activities in order to build up the strength, the speed, the stamina, the sheer courage to be able to do the kinds of things that they were going to be called to do on the battlefield. So knights were extremely well protected, extremely well trained. The armor really covered them extraordinarily well. You could no longer just slash at your opponent on the battlefield. The edge of a sword had very little effect on a fully armored knight. Weapons evolved to meet the new circumstances. If you look at this broadsword and dagger that are on display in the exhibition, you'll see that they've got a diamond-shaped cross-section. And whenever you see that, it is a giveaway that this is a weapon that was designed to go up against plate armor. These are weapons that are designed to kind of slip in between the chinks, the openings in the armor that you would see. Look at the armors that are upstairs, you'll see there are always openings that are difficult to cover with solid plates. The armpit, inside the elbow, palm of the hand, back of the leg, the groin. These are all places that would have backup protection of mail, but were still much less well protected than the places that were covered with armor plate. And these robust weapons were designed to go into those areas, lodge into the mail, and burst through the riveted links. The halberd that you see on display is another example of a weapon designed to go up against armored knights, in this case intended for foot soldiers, used en masse in infantry formations. Again, you'll see it's got that really robust point for thrusting at an armored opponent, as well as a heavy chopping blade, and that beak in the back is strong enough to actually pierce through armor. So very much a specialized weapon that helps to redress the balance in favor of infantry against mounted knights. And indeed, over the course of the 1300s, they really discovered that well-disciplined infantry in organized formations with weapons like the halberd and long spears, such as you see in this in this manuscript painting, were really able to defeat knights on the battlefield. It's how the Scots won their independence at Bannockburn in the early 1300s. And if you look at this image, you may be wondering, are those guys actually carrying guns? And the answer is yes. Something that people very rarely suspect is that plate armor appears on European battlefields at almost exactly the same time as gunpowder. Gunpowder technology takes a little bit longer to evolve to the point where it's truly effective and really affects the outcome of battle. But it's on the field in the 1300s. Cannon are becoming really effective in the 1400s. They have to give up the traditional medieval high-walled stone castle because cannons can basically knock that down. And in the 1500s, handheld firearms really come into their own. And this will ultimately put a lot of pressure on armor. But ironically, at the very moment where firearms are really starting to become important on the battlefield, armor is kind of at its apex in terms of its technical mastery. So this Maximilian field armor in the exhibition it's just an astonishing piece of work. I encourage you to go have a look at it. The complexity of shape, you have multiple different shaping programs happening at the same time. For example, the complex curvature of the breastplate at the same time as this beautifully perfect, even rows of little fluted ripples. I can't even fold a fitted bed sheet. And it's kind of a good analogy. It's not, what makes a fitted bed sheet so hard to do is you've got all this extra fabric that doesn't really want to go exactly where you want it to go. It's hard to find a place for it. Imagine if that bed sheet was made of steel. And that gives you an idea of the complexity of the craft of armoring. And hopefully the next time you look at any of these objects, whether the visiting objects from the Higgins collection or your own remarkable arms and armor collection, you can really appreciate a little bit more that extraordinary mastery of the craft that's represented by Maximilian armor of this kind. The armor again is following the trends in civilian fashion. So you look at the suit, it's got this nice square cut neckline. The plentiful ripples have really evolved to imitate the very full pleated look of civilian clothing. You can kind of see a bit of that in the foot soldiers on the bottom right in a print that's also actually on display in the exhibition. Even the detail of the lower legs, which are completely smooth, again, compare the print to the armor, it imitates the knitted silk stockings that were worn on the lower legs. The broad toes also reflect just civilian style in male footwear. So that not only is the armor spectacularly sculptural, but it's spectacularly sculptural in ways that sort of interpret soft fabric into hard steel. It's really kind of mind-blowing. The Maximilian armor is named after the emperor Maximilian, who ruled the Holy Roman Empire, roughly speaking, modern Germany plus Austria, in the early part of the 1500s, and may indeed have had a role in the development of this fashion. We do, in fact, know that Maximilian took a very active interest in the art of armoring. This print from a sort of semi-literary version of a biography of Maximilian shows Maximilian in conversation with his armorers. And it gives you a bit of a sense of what an armorer's workshop was like, and also gives you a bit of a sense of why armoring tended to run in the family. You can see the large variety of different shaped hammers, anvils, stakes. Those are like the long, that, for example, is an example of a stake. Different shaped tools that it took to generate the seemingly limitless kinds of shapes that one needed in order to make a fully effective suit of armor. You can imagine this was a very capital intensive enterprise, and it ran in the family because if your dad was an armorer, you were well set up to not just to learn the skills, but to inherit the very expensive workshop of tools that it took. And the skills were, of course, not inconsiderable, as I've alluded to before. I particularly love this comb Orion in the exhibition because it gives you a little bit of a glimpse behind the curtain of what armor making involved. You started off with a flat sheet of steel, and then by hand teased it up into this really complex shape. So that comb Orion started off as a single flat sheet of steel, and the armorer manages to coax this unforgiving material into the shape of the brim, the shape of the comb. Really quite extraordinary. Normally, once the way it works is that you start with a series of heavy hammers that are able to kind of rough out the shape, and then you move to lighter and lighter hammers as you go further down the process, and eventually get to the point of very light planishing hammers and each set of hammers helps to obliterate the marks of the previous heavier hammers, and ultimately you're kind of getting to the point where it's ready to go to the buffing and grinding wheels, and then you get the sort of gleaming steel look that appears as if no hammer has ever touched it. This particular example is representative of a type that's left hammer rough. So you can still see some the working marks that were involved in actually turning the flat sheet into this complex shape. And if you look at it well, you get a sense there's not a single hammer stroke has been wasted. He hasn't had to labor in a particular area to get it just right. This guy knew exactly what he was doing. He had been an apprentice for 7 to 14 years, perhaps, and knew how to do this quickly, economically. This is a very kind of ordinary munitions grade, kind of ordinary infantryman's kind of helmet, but it's perfectly shaped and with an economy of effort that really expresses the mastery of the practitioner. While the central part of the shaping was a traditional sort of craft done by the master with hammers and anvils and such, the early stages of extracting iron ore, turning iron ore into usable iron and turning it into flat sheets, as well as the final stages of polishing up the final result to something that had that gleam that you were looking for. Those were actually highly mechanized. Water-powered trip hammers pounded the iron out into flat sheets. At the other end of the process, water-powered buffing and grinding wheels were used to bring that final polish. So this was a very industrialized process of its day, and it's worth really bearing in mind that this is a time of great technological innovation. This pistol shield is a lovely illustration of the kind of creativity, the economic, the technological experimentation that was at play during the day. Think of the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, those kind of amazing contraptions, flying machines, tanks, things like that Leonardo was dreaming up. He wasn't the only one. This was actually a very well-developed genre. People were always coming up with kind of new and innovative ideas, and a lot of them were military then as now. The pistol shield was an idea whose time had definitely not come. Pistols are highly functional. Shields are really useful to have in a battle, but these are two flavors that were never meant to go together. The shield is quite heavy. It's it's of a style that kind of needs to be held at arm's length, and imagine trying to aim this really heavy pistol shield out here. It basically weighs about the same as a gallon of milk. So you're kind of standing out there trying to aim it. Plus, This thing here, it's that big, and the entire rest of your body is exposed. It may have been useful on shipboard. In fact, a number of these pistol shields were taken off the Mary Rose, King Henry VIII's flagship, that sank in the 1530s. But mostly, I think they were toys that Henry VIII really liked. He was extraordinarily rich, and he was a boy who loved his toys, and some fast-talking contractor got him to spend some of his ill-gotten gains on a bunch of these, and I'm sure they look very great, really wonderful in a parade. Well, this pistol shield was perhaps a bit of a technological dead end, but firearms were certainly not. And by the late 1500s, armor is showing the effect of firearms. The armor starts to become, the lines become simpler. So say this Pompeo della Chiesa suit that's in the exhibition, it's the shapes are not as complex. The decorative effects aren't really hammered into the metal the way they were with the Maximilian suit. They are surface effects that are achieved through etching and gilding, not actually executed by the armorer himself. But they are still very much an imitation of civilian fashion. That kind of etched and gilded surface is reminiscent of the kinds of patterned silks that were really fashionable. And I was super thrilled to see this doublet and the portrait on display in the exhibition today. And if you have a good look at them, you can see the patterned silk that was the kind of the hallmark of the sort of gentleman's garments of the day, imitated by the etching that's on the armor. You'll even notice, if you look, pay attention, on the doublet on the left, though these trim match the positioning of etched decoration that you'll see on the suit of armor that's right near it, and you actually see some of that as well on. You can also see some of that on this breastplate as well. So on a doublet, on the jacket that gentleman wore, civilian garment, the trim on those spots covered up the seams, because that's just how they like to make their clothing. They like to make it look as if it had never actually been sewn. No indication of seam lines on it. You use the trim to cover that up, and it's matched on the armor. So that predilection, that fondness for imitating civilian clothing remains. But gunpowder weapons are really having their impact. And indeed, you can see their impact quite literally in this siege breastplate. Have a good look at it. There are multiple bullet marks on this breastplate. And at 24 pounds, just the breastplate by itself weighs more than half the total weight of the Pompeo della Chiesa armor that we saw a moment ago at 47 pounds. So that's the kind of weight of metal that it took to stop a bullet, which gives you an idea of why the days of armor were numbered. You could wear a breastplate like this in siege operations where you didn't need to walk all that far. You just walking the walls of the parapets of a fortification or the siege trenches, but you're not going to actually march 10 or 15 miles a day in this kind of thing. So the days of armor are definitely numbered by this point. And yet, armor still remains very strong in the cultural imagination of the day. And indeed, this is the period when Cervantes writes his Don Quixote, kind of mocking the continuing fondness of European culture for these tales of knightly valor in an age when knightly valor was really no longer impactful on the battlefield. This kind of idealization of the medieval past is embedded in this fabulous jousting armor in the exhibition. Indeed, the armor itself is a kind of fossilized version of a late medieval battlefield armor. If you look at the helmet on this suit, and right nearby it in the same gallery, you'll see this late medieval helmet here. You'll see that they have essentially the same kind of shape. The Rensoi, that jousting armor, is essentially it comes of a late medieval version of jousting where the combatants in this sport would wear basically their battlefield armor, but they'd add a few protective pieces, particularly on the left-hand side. Jousters passed each other left side to left side, so the left side was really the most vulnerable portion of you. So you put a few extra reinforces there. And so you'll see on this jousting armor that there's a lot of extra protection on that suit. But by this time, that it's become, as I say, fossilized into a solely something that you would wear for jousting. It's extremely protective and also extremely encumbering. Look at the weight here, twice as much as the Pompeo armor that we saw a moment. Extremely heavy to wear, but also very, very protective with all of the little reinforcing plates, really thick steel. This is going to protect you really well in the controlled circumstances of the joust, where you don't need to have a wide range of vision, you don't need to fight for hours on end, you don't need to worry about somebody coming up behind you, you know exactly who's going to come at you, when they're coming, how they're coming, and so you can wear armor that is designed precisely for this. What I would love to be doing this evening with you would be doing a gallery tour, but obviously wouldn't be room for all of us. But the nice thing about PowerPoint is it does allow me to show you things that I could not actually show you in the gallery. And the inside of that jousting armor is one good example. It actually retains its old lining. These armor elements had to have padding on the inside. Again, you can imagine wearing a helmet that's just steel against your head without some kind of a padded lining inside. It's going to hurt a lot if somebody hits you there. So there's this padded lining on the inside, protecting particularly the head. It's probably not the very original lining from the early, from the late part of the 1500s. This armor was in use for a long time after that, and this is probably a refit, but still a refit from the working life of the armor itself. A bit of a closer view. As you can imagine, padded lining that people are sweating into when they're jousting gets damaged over time and shows its age, but in this case, it gives us a chance to actually see the stuffing. And this close-up, people often ask, what's that little piece of leather dangling outside of the faceplate on this armor? And this shows you what's going on the inside. There's this little leather thong. When you pull it, pulls a bolt against the coiled spring that you see here, releasing the catch and allowing you to open up this little door that gets a little bit more airflow into the armor that, as you can imagine, is extremely hot, dehydrating, and also not an awful lot of airflow inside, and people can really overheat without something like that. And as I mentioned a moment ago, this armor was in use for a very long time. Inscribed on the back plate in paint is the name of Herr General Leutnant von Bolse, who was a courtier at the Dresden court in the early part of the 1700s. So something like a century and a half after the armor was worn, it was still being used for probably light sorts of forms of jousting, derivative forms of jousting at the Dresden court. And because it needed to be personalized for the person who was wearing it, they inscribed their names in it, kind of like my mom did when I went to grade school. So in this exhibition, I I have really focused on really the core of the Higgins collection. The collection is pretty Eurocentric, but we do have some great other sort of non-European objects in the collection, and one could tell very similar and interestingly intersecting sorts of stories of other parts of the world. And I tried to suggest a bit of that in the exhibition. This helmet, I can guarantee you, is not leaving the Worcester Art Museum again anytime soon. It really is one of the stellar treasures of the Higgins collection, and I'm sure if it were in Japan today, you could not get it out. It was a very well-known, much admired helmet in the 1600s. There are in fact a couple of imitations out there, but this is absolutely the finest of its kind. A really amazing tour de force of the armorer's craft at a time when Japan was really starting into its period of 2.5 centuries of peace. The island had been united under Tokugawa Ieyasu, and really serious warfare was virtually at an end. And yet the Tokugawa shoguns really emphasized the importance of maintaining these old martial traditions, including wearing the arms and armor, which really continued in court use right the way through until the mid 1800s. Indeed, if you look at this helmet on display, you'll see there's a bunch of holes around the bottom edge of the back there. And these are for attaching a shikoro. It's a neck guard that's laced onto the top of the helmet. And the holes are a little bit higgledy-piggledy, and that's because there are, it was refitted at multiple times as the style of the neck guard changed. The lacing pattern had to change, and so new holes had to be drilled into the metal for this object that was clearly in use over a protracted period of time. Similar things can be said about this really lovely Sudanese helmet. Very rare to have such a high level gilt example of this kind of object. And the mail coat has such a great story behind it. Originally made in Europe, ultimately exported from Europe, basically as military surplus. Once European armies were no longer using mail, they shipped a lot of it out to the Middle East, to India, where it was reused, refitted. This shirt started off, it was made in Europe, probably Nuremberg, around 1500. It was about hip length, and either in the Ottoman Empire or in the Sudan, it was extended with those long skirts, which interestingly make it kind of a lot more like the sort of armor that medieval knights were wearing. The Sudanese soldiers who wore this, certainly a leader in the part of in the case of the helmet, were really they wore this in the late 1800s, the period of the Mahdist rebellion of the 1880s and 1890s. These two objects were very likely worn during those rebellions at the end of the 1800s, and the men who wore this clearly experienced them as a way to connect with the early stages of Islam. This was in their heads, and to some degree in reality, the kind of thing that was being worn by Muhammad and his followers in those early stages of Islam. Of course, in retrospect, unsurprisingly, when this kind of equipment went up against early versions of the machine gun in the 1890s in the hands of the British, the slaughter was enormous. But it should be borne in mind that this kind of attachment to the military past is not just something that was happening by this time in the 1800s in Japan or in Africa. This photograph of French troops going to the front at the beginning of World War I, wearing helmets and breastplates and backplates of the kind, essentially that went right back to the Middle Ages. The design had been reworked to look a little bit more kind of pseudo-Roman along the lines of this suit that you can see in the exhibition. But the origins of these equipment that they were wearing really went back to the medieval period. This equipment, of course, did not survive World War I and was never really revived. But interestingly, this is as old versions of armor went out of use, new kinds of armor were being rediscovered. In 1916, as the American Army kind of looked at what was happening in Europe and realized there was a very real possibility that America would be dragged into the war, they knew that they were going to need to find a way to equip American soldiers for this eventuality with helmets for the realities of trench warfare. And nobody in America really knew much about helmets, or almost nobody. The Army turned to Bashford Dean, who was the curator of arms and armor at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and put him in charge of an Army project to reinvent the helmet for the 21st century. Dean came up with various kinds of armor designs based on his knowledge of historical armor. The Model 5 helmet that you see here is one such example. But it wasn't good enough that the armor should be protective and effective. It had to be something you could reproduce at quantity. And Dean did not have the industry expertise to bring to bear on that question. And that is where John Woodman Higgins comes into the story. Higgins was brought into this project as an industry consultant. The Model 2 helmet you saw a moment ago was made in Higgins's factory. And so Higgins began a friendship with Dean that would bring real fruit in the following decade. Higgins was a steel industrialist in Worcester, specialized in stamped steel, flat sheets of steel that were stamped into various kinds of shapes. And he started his factory in the early part of the 1900s. And about 1926, he decided he wanted to create a museum on the grounds of the factory. Started collecting armor quite aggressively in the late 1920s, and by the end of the decade really had enough assembled to fill the museum that he opened in 1931. The Higgins Armory was built on the grounds of the factory, and the two wings of the armory were given over to ancient versions of metalcraft and modern. And the modern was very diverse. As you can see, it's on the right-hand side of the image here. But in the ancient wing, it was mostly the suits of armor. Higgins's famous 100 suits of steel. He and of course people often ask, where did he get them? He acquired a lot of these in New York through dealers at auctions and so on, and some of the objects are better documented than others. This suit of armor from the exhibition is one of the better documented examples. It was in the Chilla collection in Germany, in Saxony, in the early part of the 1890s. Chilla sent it over to the US to be displayed at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. It was incorporated into the Tiffany Pavilion. Tiffany undertook to actually sell these objects after the exhibition was over. It went into the collection of Oliver Belmont in the Northeast, to Clarence Mackey in the New York area in the early part of the 1900s, and ultimately landed in the Higgins collection in 1940. And where it was a star piece in the Higgins collection, Norman Rockwell famously captured it. In his sketch shown here for what ultimately became a cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And you can actually, there's a couple of objects in the exhibition that are incorporated into Rockwell's sketch. Higgins Armory continued until 2013, but ultimately we didn't really have the kind of endowment that made us sustainable. We had to close our doors at the end of 2013. The collection went to the Worcester Art Museum. About 100 objects are currently on display, and it totally broke my heart that so many star pieces from the collection had to go into storage because of the limited space available to us during the time when we were fundraising and planning for the eventual installation of a dedicated Arms and Armor gallery. So in the meantime, we have a scattering of Arms and Armor in the galleries, other objects in storage, but I was very thrilled that we were able to make this tour happen. We will certainly never send out so much of the Higgins collection at such a high level of quality again. We couldn't really strip our gallery again in the future. So I'm really thrilled that we were able to bring this collection here to St. Louis. These are wonderful objects, and there's nothing, as the curator of the collection, there's nothing I enjoy more than sharing them with people, and I have enjoyed sharing them with you this evening.
We do have time for a few questions. We're going to walk around with some microphones. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll see how many we get to.
Two questions. One is, how long did it take to build a full set of armor in time? And the other one, well, how did the armorers proof their breastplates against when the gun became a reality in the early period? Did they proof their work to be able to turn a ball and not go through the armor itself?
Really great question. So, of course, the time that it took to make a suit of armor depended in part on how fancy the armor was, but just as a kind of benchmark, imagine it taking, it could say an armorer plus an advanced assistant, like a journeyman, plus maybe one or two apprentices. They might pull together a suit of armor in about 3 months or so. A full, and I'm thinking about a full head-to-toe suit, but not necessarily, including a rich decoration with etching or something like that. Your other question was proofing. Yes, one of the marks on that siege breastplate that I showed you is probably a proof mark. I think it's the only object in this show that may have a proof mark. They did test these objects. Not always, and of course a lot depended on what the client expected. Certainly already by the 1300s, they are proofing armor with crossbows to demonstrate that the armor can withstand the power of a crossbow bolt. And then, yes, when as gunpowder really weapons became more prominent, that became the more normal form of proofing, and there were different sort of levels of proofing. And indeed, so you might order maybe your arm armor and your leg armor might be pistol proof, whereas your head and torso would be shot proof, musket proof. Different sizes of weapons, different powers of weapons require different levels of proofing to be that protective.
Hi, I also have two questions. Wonderful presentation. So the first one is, I noticed there were a lot of acquisitions in the year 2014. If there was a special grant or gift that asked for purchases in this area, or did the museum see a specific need where they wanted to bolster their collection? So that's the first one. The second one is, how did it come to be that this collection of fine work from Boston was able to be shown here at the St. Louis Art Museum?
So the first question is straightforward. The Higgins Armory closed in 2013. In 2014, the collection was moved from the Higgins Armory to the Worcester Art Museum. It's about a 2-mile move, but it's 2 miles are a very long distance when you're dealing with priceless artworks. So the entire Higgins collection starts with a 2014 acquisition date. And then, in terms of bringing the collection here, we worked with an agency that did the marketing for us, and then of course our various teams, our conservation team, our registration team worked with the folks here to do all the logistics of shipping the objects here. We always send our conservator here to help with the setup. Assembling a suit of armor is a very specialized skill that is not on the the roster of usual conservation skills that one might expect to have in-house. In this case, increased by the fact that we included an equestrian installation, the horse mannequin, which I gather gave them a lot of trouble. I think they spent a full day trying to get that guy up and mounted. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I think the
I was curious how the armor was maintained back in the day, considering like they didn't have Rust-Oleum.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's what squires and pages are for, and servants. So, and in fact, in a lot of ways, that whole feudal structure has a lot to do with what it took, both to create that armor for the knight and also to support the knight in the kind of lifestyle and with the kind of support staff. Basically, a knight needed a pit crew. This stuff got damaged in battle. There'd have to be a traveling armorer with an army who could repair broken rivets, broken buckles and belts and straps and stuff like that. And the armor, of course, would rust if you weren't maintaining it. So in a lot of ways, what they needed to do then was kind of what we do now in conservation, just some differential in the specifics of the technique. But A, you keep it clean, and B, once it's clean, you coat the surface in some kind of a protective layer. Back then, they might have used some kind of an oil. Nowadays, we will use a microcrystalline wax. And we're much more careful in the cleaning, but they must have been pretty careful in the cleaning too, particularly if you're dealing with an etched and gilt armor, that the surface decoration can come off very easily.
So we have one last question.
Hi. Was there much standardization of metallurgy in medieval European manufacturing, or was it more ad hoc or varied by manufacturer and to manufacturer?
Yeah, that's a massive question. Of course, the first thing that I would say about metallurgy is that the entire modern technology of metallurgy rests on the thermometer. Everything that you do with metals is kind of dependent on time, temperature, and I can't remember what the third T is, but metals respond to being brought up to certain kinds of temperatures, and ores also. And thermometers had not yet been invented. So it was very much a kind of qualitative craft. Basically, what I would, think about, imagine cooking without a temperature dial on your oven. It would be kind of the same sort of skill. It's doable. People did it for a very long time, and they were able to make amazing dishes for the crowned heads of Europe. But you have to develop a sense, like a kind of, a gut sense of when it's reached the temperature. And, indeed, when something's, even just making pancakes, if you've made pancakes for a long time, you have a sense when the griddle's reached the right heat. They sort of had that same kind of sense. It was much more difficult to reach, and that's why the apprenticeship would typically take between 7 and 14 years to get to the point of being able to make this stuff as an apprentice, let alone as a journeyman, let alone as a master. It's kind of amazing to me that they were able to do it at all. Everything on which metallurgy depends today, they didn't know anything about elements. The word carbon just means charcoal. They used charcoal, but they had no idea that carbon plays a certain role in the chemical transformation of iron ore into usable iron, and then transforming usable iron into steel. Carbon is the key ingredient in both of those processes. They just knew you needed to use charcoal. You couldn't just use ordinary wood. Back then, you couldn't use ordinary coal or the pit coal, mined coal. It was just generations and generations of trial and error that allowed them to do what they did. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Thank you very much.